Hi everyone, I'm Dean Friedman, Director of the New York School of Synthesis. Here to tell you everything you need to know about the reproductive processes of the yellow speckle-bellied salamander.
Dean!
Sorry. Correction. Actually, I'm here to explain everything there is to know about music synthesis and how to make sounds on all these neat, amazing synthesizers. So please excuse the dumb jokes, but let's face it, this subject is very boring. However, if you're patient and bear with me, I'll try and make it as painless as possible for you. So, ready? Here's what you're going to learn in this three-part series. First, we're going to talk a little bit about sound and how all sounds are made up of vibrations. Then we're going to talk about the three elements of sound, and they are pitch, timbre, and volume. Learn how to control these three elements of sound, and you'll actually be able to modify existing sounds or design from scratch any sound you can imagine. And once we've talked about the three elements of sound, we'll go on to examine the five most common waveforms: the square wave, the sawtooth wave, the triangle wave, the pulse wave, and the sine wave. Every synthesizer under the sun uses at least two or three of these waveforms to either generate or modulate part of the sound. And finally, once you know one waveform from another, we will cover the 7 main components of a synthesizer. And just in case you're curious about those 7 main components, they are the oscillator, the amplifier, the filter, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, the pitch envelope, and the LFO. And that's it. Really, once you understand about vibration, about the 3 elements of sound, about the 5 most common waveforms, and finally the 7 main components of a synthesizer, you will be well on your way to designing your very own sounds on your very own synthesizer. Sounds easy, huh? Well, actually, it's not all that hard once you've got these basic concepts down. And by the way, these rules of sound apply to every synthesizer ever made, old or new, whether you're talking about a Yamaha DX11 or a Roland Juno 1 or a Korg M1 or an Oberheim Matrix 12, this information still applies. All synths have envelopes. All synths have oscillators. All synths have some kind of an LFO. The approaches may be different, but the general principles of sound are still the same. So, ready? Because here we go. All sounds are made up of vibrations. Plug a string on a guitar, and the vibration travels from the string through the air into your ear, where you hear it as a sound. The same with a saxophone. Blow into the mouthpiece, and you cause the wooden reed to vibrate. A hammer striking a piano string, the mouthpiece of a trumpet. All these things generate vibrations which travel through the air to our ears, where we hear the vibrations of sound. Now, in a synthesizer, we create sound by setting up electrical vibrations in the circuitry. When these electrical vibrations are amplified and sent to a speaker, they cause the speaker to vibrate, and just like the guitar string or the saxophone reed, the vibration in the speaker travels through the air and we hear it as sound. Synthesized sound. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? Because a lot of what you do on a synthesizer has to do with controlling vibrations. All right, let's go over some necessary shop talk regarding sound and vibration, just so you don't sound stupid at cocktail parties when people start talking about sound vibrations. Here's some basic terminology. A simple unit of vibration is referred to as a cycle. The number of cycles that occur in a given time period is referred to as frequency. In other words, frequency refers to the speed of a vibration. The number of cycles or individual vibrations that occur in a single second are referred to as hertz. Not the rent-a-car, but hertz. In other words, if a note on a trumpet vibrates at a rate of, say, 440 times a second, we say that the note has a frequency of 440 hertz. The term kilohertz equals 1,000 hertz. So if we say a sound has a frequency of 5 kilohertz, or 5K, we mean that it has a frequency of 5,000 cycles a second. That is, it's vibrating 5,000 times a second. Just so you have some frame of reference for all this let's talk about the audible frequency range. The audible frequency range is the frequency range in which we, as humans, as opposed to porcupines or wombats, are capable of perceiving sound. This range falls between 20 hertz and 20K. That is, between 20 vibrations a second and 20,000 vibrations a second. Anything that falls within that range, we will hear as sound. Anything that falls above or below that range will not be discernible to us. Now, as some of you no doubt know, dogs are capable of hearing frequencies which are higher than that. They can hear sounds that we can't hear. And it was only discovered recently that elephants are capable of discerning frequencies which are in fact much lower than the audible frequency range for humans. Maybe those big ears have something to do with it. I don't know. In fact, some people postulate that homing pigeons navigate by being able to hear the sub-audio frequencies which are generated by mountain ranges and the movement of the continental plates. Strange but true. Anyway, the point of all this is that vibrations in a given range make sounds that we hear. And all the terms I just mentioned, cycle, frequency, hertz, kilohertz, all these terms have to do with the sound's vibration. Learning how to control and manipulate these vibrations is what music synthesis is all about. So let's talk more about these sound vibrations. First of all, how is it we can tell one sound from another? How do we differentiate a trumpet sound from, say, an electric guitar sound? And for that matter, when we hear two different notes played on the same instrument, how do we tell those two notes apart? Well, different sounds are created by different kinds of vibrations. And in order to discuss those differences, we need to examine the three main elements of sound. And they are pitch, timbre, and volume. Having fun so far? Listen, all sounds can be described in terms of these three main elements. So let's start with pitch. Actually, pitch is just the musical term for frequency. If a sound has a frequency of 440 hertz, that means it has a pitch of A above middle C. In fact, anything that vibrates at a rate of 440 times a second is going to generate the pitch of A. A guitar string or a saxophone reed, even a building. If a building were to vibrate 440 times a second, it would fall down, but as it was falling down, you would hear a big A. So, pitch equals frequency. In sound, the higher the rate of vibration, the higher the pitch, and vice versa. The lower the frequency of a sound, the lower its pitch. And we can use this basic principle of pitch when we sit down to design sounds. If you're trying to synthesize the sound of a high-pitched instrument, such as a flute or piccolo, you reach for the part of the synthesizer that controls frequency, the oscillator, and dial up a high frequency. If you're trying to create a fat bass sound, you dial up a low frequency. In its simplest terms, controlling pitch allows you to establish a range for your sound, be it high, medium, or low. But more than that, being able to control pitch opens up the door to a whole range of sound design options like chorusing, vibrato, programmed pitch bend, and stuff like that. That's pitch. Now let's talk about timbre, or timbre, as lumberjacks say. Timbre refers to a sound's unique character. Timbre has to do with the sound's color, its tone, that is, its brightness or darkness. Timbre is how we tell the sound of a trumpet from the sound of an oboe, even if they're playing the same exact pitch. A sound's timbre has to do with its harmonic structure. And in order to define timbre, we first have to understand all about harmonics. Okay, you with me so far? Remember, before you start to make sounds by twiddling with knobs and sliders, you need to understand what sound is made up of. So, harmonics. Here's a useful analogy. When a painter paints a picture of the sky, odds are good that the first thing he'll do is grab a tube of blue paint. But that's not all. Depending on the particular kind of sky he wants to paint, cloudy or clear, he may grab a tube of white or gray or yellow or even red, and what he'll do is mix and combine those colors and hues in appropriate amounts to achieve the particular shade of blue sky he has in mind. True, the sky is still blue, and blue is the main paint color used in the sky, but in fact it's a composite blue, made up of various shades and hues, all contributing to the unique quality and character of this particular blue sky. A composite color. Sound is color. In fact, I'm not just being poetic when I say that. They are, after all, just different ends of the energy spectrum, sound and light. Just as our blue sky is made up of various colors, most sounds are made up of various frequencies. In other words, they are composite sounds. When you hear the note C played on a trumpet, you're not just hearing that C. You're hearing an octave above that C, a G a fifth above the octave, another octave C, the E a third above that. In fact, you're hearing an entire series of related frequencies, all of which combine in varying amounts to the unique quality of the main frequency of C. Just as those other colors combine to create a particular kind of blue, these other frequencies combine to create a particular kind of C. C is still the main frequency. It is the lowest frequency in the sound as well as the loudest, but it is not alone. The fact of its being the loudest and lowest means that we discern its pitch above all of the other frequencies, and as the main frequency, we refer to it as the fundamental. All the other frequencies that make up the composite sound are called harmonics, or overtones, or partials. Those three terms, harmonics, overtones, and partials, all refer to the same thing, those upper frequencies above the fundamental which when combined give a sound its unique tone, its timbre. We call this arrangement a sound's harmonic spectrum. And what's important to realize is that the arrangement of these harmonics in pitched instruments is not random. In fact, they fall into a very fixed and predictable pattern, which we call the natural harmonic series. When I refer to pitched instruments, I mean any instrument like a piano, guitar, brass, woodwind, that produces a discernible pitch, a musical note, as opposed to non-pitched percussive instruments like drums, bells, cymbals, woodblocks, and the like. The difference is that pitched instruments have a very orderly and predictable harmonic spectrum. As I just said, the natural harmonic series, whereas non-pitched instruments like drums and bells don't. You see, if you examine the harmonic relationship in a pitched instrument, you'll discover a very strict mathematical ratio between the fundamental and its harmonics. The frequency of the harmonics in ascending order will be 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times the fundamental, and so on. These are all whole number multiples of the fundamental. On the other hand, on non-pitched instruments, the composite frequencies have very irregular and unpredictable relationships. In fact, it's often difficult on non-pitched instruments to determine the fundamental pitch at all. Take a bell, for example. Instead of a bell's harmonics being 2, 3, or 4 times the fundamental, they might be 2.7 times or 1/3 times the fundamental, an irregular harmonic relationship which results in a characteristic non-pitched dissonant sound. So why am I telling you all this? Well, because once you understand the ingredients of timbre and how to manipulate harmonics, you can then create your own timbres. For example, let's apply our knowledge of harmonics to making a simple bell. Now, I just told you a moment ago that one characteristic of a bell sound is that its harmonics are not whole number multiples of the fundamental. That, in fact, the harmonics of a bell are irregular or dissonant. Let's hear what that actually means. First, I'll design a basic bell-like envelope. A short attack and a long release. Now, using my knowledge of pitch, I'll dial up a high frequency. Almost bell-like, but not quite. Now let's try adding a harmonic that is obviously dissonant and see what happens to the character of the sound. You can hear how by simply introducing a single dissonant harmonic into a sound, you can go a long way towards capturing the unique metallic element which is characteristic of a bell sound. The point is we're able to achieve this effect on purpose, using a basic understanding of harmonics. So we've established that the harmonic content of a sound is responsible for its timbre. Now understand that in its simplest form, controlling timbre is simply a matter of making a sound brighter or darker. If a sound has a lot of upper harmonics, it will be bright. If it has mostly lower harmonics and fundamental, it will be dark. On a typical analog or hybrid synth, we would achieve that by opening or closing the filter. As we open the filter, we allow the higher harmonics to be heard. The sound gets brighter. As we close the filter, we remove the upper harmonics, leaving mostly the fundamental, making the sound darker. If we close the filter almost completely, we're left with pure fundamental, no harmonics. Okay, we've discussed pitch and we've discussed timbre. And if you've been paying attention, instead of playing with your belly button lip, then you should understand that whereas pitch refers to the main or fundamental frequency of a sound, timbre refers to an assortment of frequencies called harmonics, which are related to the main frequency called the fundamental. Got it? You sure? Okay. Let's continue. Let's talk about volume. Folks, how on earth can we sell synthesizer videos at such incredibly low prices? Well, I'll tell you. The answer is volume, volume, volume. Just kidding. Actually, the main aspect of volume has to do with the overall shape of a sound. Some sounds, like a piano sound, start abruptly with a sudden attack and then die out gradually. Other sounds, like a bowed violin, start gradually. They have a slow attack and they die out gradually. Different sounds have different shapes, and these shapes are a function of volume. We refer to a sound's overall shape as its volume envelope. Let's look at that bowed string sound again. It starts in silence at 0 volume, and then gradually the volume increases. It reaches a peak volume level, and then it sustains for as long as the note is held down. Then, once you release the note, it gradually fades out back into silence. The increases and decreases in volume are what give the note its shape, its volume envelope. Just as we have a way of controlling pitch using a frequency control, and just as we control timbre using some kind of filter control, there's a section on every synthesizer that allows you to design the shape or volume envelope of a sound. And that's called the volume envelope. Listen to what happens when I take this nice string sound and give it a sudden attack instead of a gradual one. And a quick release instead of a gradual one. And no sustain at all. This is how it used to sound. Now here's how it sounds. You can see how drastically you can change a sound by altering its volume envelope. We'll talk more about the volume envelope in a while. For now, just try and understand that any sound can be described in terms of these 3 elements: pitch, timbre, and volume. And each of these aspects of a sound can then be addressed on a corresponding component on a synthesizer. You want to affect the sound's pitch, you reach for the frequency control of the oscillator. You want to affect the sound's timbre or its brightness, you reach for the filter, or in the case of an FM synth, you look for the modulator. you want to alter the overall shape of a sound, you reach for the volume envelope. The point is, if you understand the elements of sound, you'll be able to program any synthesizer. Because all synthesizers, regardless of make or model number, have to obey the same principles of sound. They all have to somehow address those same three elements: pitch, timbre, and volume. Okay, you can go take a break now, eat a bowl of Cheerios or something. Ready to continue? Here we go. The 5 most common waveforms. They are the square wave, the sawtooth wave, the triangle wave, the pulse wave, and the sine wave. All synths will employ at least 2 or 3 of these different waveforms. So, from the top, the square wave. All right, imagine your name is Bob Moog, and you're sitting down to invent the modern synthesizer. And you say to yourself, okay, I need to generate an electronic signal, some constantly repeating vibration, to produce a synthesized sound. So how do I do it easily and inexpensively? Well, the easiest way to create an electrical vibration is to do this. Turn something on and off real fast. Do it fast enough, say 440 times a second, and you create an electronically synthesized sound. Well, that's not that hard to do. There are circuits that go instantly on and then instantly off, or positive and then negative, and that's what he did. The result is a vibration called the square wave. The name describes the shape of a single cycle of the waveform. The sound of a square wave is round with a little bit of edge. Well, that wasn't so hard. We have a waveform that goes instantly on for half a cycle and then goes instantly off for half a cycle. What happens if we make a wave that goes instantly on and then gradually off? Well, you get a sawtooth wave, or what's sometimes called a ramp wave. The sound of a sawtooth wave is rather buzzy with a lot of edge, as opposed to the square wave. So, we have a square wave which goes instantly on and then instantly off. A sawtooth wave that goes instantly on and then gradually off. What if we make a wave that goes gradually on and then gradually off? It's called a triangle wave. The sound of a triangle wave is round and pure with almost no edge or buzziness. Square, sawtooth, triangle. The other good thing about the triangle wave is that it doesn't sound anything like the square wave or the sawtooth wave, thereby providing a variety of different waveforms to choose from when selecting source material for a sound. So, what do you know? So far, we've got 3 different waveforms, all relatively easy to generate, with 3 drastically different sounds. Variety at a bargain price. Next, let's talk about the pulse wave. You know how in geometry, a square is actually a special kind of a rectangle with equal sides and angles. Well, a square wave is actually a special kind of pulse wave. You see, a pulse wave is just like a square wave, in that it goes instantly on and then instantly off, except that whereas a square wave is up 50% of the time and then down 50% of the time, a pulse wave can be up 30% of the time and down 70% of the time, or up 25% and down 75%. A pulse wave is variable, sort of like adjustable roller skates. You change the proportions of a pulse wave to suit your needs. And as you change the ratio, or what's called the duty cycle of a pulse wave, you also change its sound. In other words, you can get many different waveforms for the price of one. The pulse wave can sound either thin and reedy when the duty cycle is around 10 or 15%, or it can sound round with a little edge when the duty cycle is at 50%. And in fact, when you set the duty cycle of a pulse wave so that the ratio is 50-50, what you actually have is a square wave. Usually any synthesizer that offers you a pulse wave will offer you the means with which to change the width of the pulse wave. As you see, when the pulse wave has a duty cycle of 50%, it actually is a square wave. Got it? Good. So we've got the square wave, the sawtooth or ramp wave, the triangle wave, and the pulse wave, which is like the square wave but variable. And finally, let's talk about the sine wave. A sine wave is a single pure frequency. Just as an atom is the smallest building block of matter, a sine wave is the smallest building block of sound. When we refer to a sound's timbre and its harmonic spectrum being made up of numerous frequencies, those individual frequencies are actually sine waves, pure vibrations. The fundamental frequency is also a single sine wave. It's when we start combining those individual pure sine waves to create a harmonic spectrum that we create the other kinds of waveforms, such as square waves and sawtooth waves. The sine wave looks like this. The sound of a sine wave is absolutely pure and flute-like. The sine wave is also important because, as the basic building block of sound, it plays a crucial role in the creation of FM sounds, something we'll talk a little bit about towards the end of the series. All of these 5 waveforms sound different from one another. But not only do these different waveforms offer a variety of different sounding source material to choose from, but each of them has a totally different function when used as modulators in the LFO. We use the word modulate to describe what happens when one waveform is applied to another waveform to affect its sound. When these 5 waveforms are used as modulators in the LFO, they help create effects such as tremolo and vibrato. For example, listen to the effect a triangle wave has on a sound when it's used in the LFO to modulate pitch. Okay, now listen to how a square wave sounds doing the same thing. As you can see, different waveforms have different modulating characteristics. Here's how a square wave modulates pitch. A sawtooth wave going down. A sawtooth wave going up. And a triangle wave. Different waveforms have different characteristics, both as sound sources and as sound modulators. Become familiar with them because you'll find them popping up all over the place. Anyway, that's them. The 5 most common waveforms. So, where are we? We've talked about vibrations. We've talked about the 3 elements of sound, pitch, timbre, and volume. And we've talked about the 5 most common waveforms. Now I'm going to introduce the 7 components of a synthesizer. Once we've discussed these 7 components, you'll know enough about synthesis to actually begin making some of your own sounds. Here goes. The 7 components of a synthesizer are the amplifier, the oscillator, the filter, the volume envelope, the filter envelope, the pitch envelope, and the LFO. Now, before we start, I have to say one thing. Some of you wise guys out there might be sitting home saying, well, wait a minute, I have an FM synthesizer or a Casio C or something like that or the other, and I don't have a filter or a filter envelope, so what's he talking about? Even if you don't have a component that is labeled filter envelope on your synthesizer, the fact of the matter is every synthesizer in existence has some means by which it allows you to change and manipulate the harmonic content and the harmonic envelope of a sound. Remember we talked about harmonics? Good. The point is, even if your synthesizer doesn't contain the word filter anywhere in its panel, it still has the equivalent of a filter, whether it's called a modulator or something else. As I explain the 7 main components of a synthesizer, I'll be giving examples of how each of these 7 main components is represented on some of today's most popular synthesizers. The point is, the principles I'm explaining to you relate to all brands of synthesizers: digital, analog, hybrid, or hyper-cross translateral. Trust me on this one. Okay. In very general terms, here's what these 7 components do. The amplifier, also known as the VCA or DCA. The amplifier controls the volume of a sound. It makes things louder and softer. Remember we talked about the volume envelope, the overall shape of the sound. Well, it's the job of the amplifier, along with the instructions it gets from the volume envelope, to make the sound louder and then softer. I'll demonstrate all this when we get to the volume envelope. So the amplifier controls volume. Next, the oscillator, also known as the OSC, the VCO, or the DCO. The oscillator controls the frequency of a sound. Remember we talked about pitch and how in musical terms frequency equals pitch? Well, the oscillator controls the pitch of a sound. If we want to make a high-pitched piccolo sound, we reach for the oscillator and do this. If we want to make a low-pitched bass sound, we reach for the oscillator and do this. Now, some of you are probably wondering why I'm demonstrating some of these parameters on what appears to be an ancient analog synthesizer. Well, the reason is because it's got knobs and faders. And it enables us to, first of all, program sounds a lot more quickly than the modern digital keyboards, and also have an opportunity to see what's happening to the parameter as we change it. The point to keep in mind is that this seemingly ancient synthesizer still addresses sound in the same exact way that the modern digital keyboards do. The same principles of sound apply. To demonstrate that, let me show you how I can change frequency exactly the same way on a newer keyboard. There are other ways of controlling the oscillator and therefore altering the pitch of a sound. One way is by using the LFO. We'll get to that in a minute. For now, just remember the oscillator controls pitch. The filter, also known as the VCF or DCF, or any number of strange pseudonyms, the filter controls the harmonic content of a sound. In other words, it controls a sound's timbre. Remember timbre, don't you? In very general terms, what this means is that it is responsible for making a sound brighter or darker. You could even think of it as a sort of tone control, like the one in your stereo. Turn it one way and the sound gets brighter. Turn it the other way and the sound gets darker. What the filter is actually doing is increasing or decreasing the amount of upper harmonics that are present in the sound. If you open the filter, you allow the upper harmonics to be heard, and the sound will sound brighter. As you close the filter, you filter out those upper harmonics, and the sound becomes duller and darker. The filter controls the overall brightness of a sound. Remember, if you have a Yamaha DX or TX synth that generates sound using FM, don't worry that you don't have a filter. The modulator serves the same purpose. It controls the harmonic content of a sound. It makes the sound brighter or darker. More on this later. Anyway, as I just said, the point is that the filter controls the harmonic content or the timbre of the sound. Got it? Good. So is any of this starting to make sense? Do you see now why we started off talking about the 3 elements of sound? So I'd have a way of describing what these components actually do to a sound. Okay, let's continue. The amplifier controls volume, the oscillator controls pitch, the filter controls brightness. Next come the 3 envelope generators. the volume envelope, the filter envelope, and the pitch envelope. We've already talked a little bit about the volume envelope as it relates to the third element of sound, volume. Let's examine it a little more closely. The volume envelope is actually a group of settings that send instructions to the amplifier telling it when to get loud, how loud to get, and how fast it should take to get there. It's kind of like a dumb football player jock and his coach. Really, the amplifier is the dumb jock, and the envelope generator is the coach that tells him what to do. So, for example, when I press a key down with my finger, the envelope yells to the amplifier, "Hey, he pressed his finger down. Hurry up and start getting louder until you reach your peak volume." And the amplifier starts getting louder. And the envelope generator says, "Okay, you've reached your peak volume. Start getting softer until you reach your sustain level. And just stay at that level until I tell you what to do." And so the amplifier goes to the sustain level and stays there like a dummy, waiting for the envelope generator to tell it what to do. And finally, the envelope generator shouts to the amplifier, "Okay, he took his finger off the key, so go back to 0. Make sure you take 4 seconds to get there." So as you can see, the amplifier in tandem with one of the 3 envelope generators creates the volume envelope for a sound. The envelope generator is generating instructions about rates and levels. In other words, how fast to get loud, how loud to get. These instructions are responsible for giving a sound a dynamic shape. Without them, the sound would just sit there like a lump. Envelopes create motion over time. They change things automatically. The original envelopes had only 3 or 4 stages. They were called ADSR, which stands for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Nowadays, we have envelopes with as many as 8 or 16 stages, each with its own rate and level. We'll talk about them in more detail in part 2. The point is, even though today's envelopes are a little more flexible, they still serve the same function as the original ADSRs. They give a shape to the sound. There are 2 other envelopes to discuss, and they are the filter envelope and the pitch envelope. Both of these envelopes are identical in function to the volume envelope. The only difference has to do with what other component they're affecting. The volume envelope created a shape for the sound's volume by sending instructions to the amplifier. In the same way, the filter envelope creates a shape for the sound's brightness by sending instructions to the filter. Listen to this brass sound. Not only does the sound have an overall volume envelope shape, but if you listen to the brassy blat at the beginning of the note, you can hear that the sound also has a separate shape for the brightness of the sound. This is called a brightness envelope or a harmonic envelope, or to use the more commonly used term, a filter envelope. It's as if the filter envelope has been superimposed on top of the volume envelope. At times, it can be hard to tell them apart, but they are distinct, and you can learn to distinguish between the 2. By having both of them, you add one more dimension to the motion of your sound, one more tool for making your sound more interesting. Next, there's the pitch envelope. Same deal. The volume envelope in tandem with the amplifier affects loudness. The filter envelope in tandem with the filter affects brightness. Well, the pitch envelope in tandem with the oscillator affects, you guessed it, pitch. Listen to this sound. What's happening is the envelope generator in the pitch envelope is sending instructions to the oscillator. Remember the oscillator? It controls pitch. Just like all other envelopes, it's sending rate and level instructions about when, how fast, and how much. The only difference is that instead of those instructions controlling loudness or brightness, they're controlling pitch. Still, as envelopes do, it is changing one of the elements of the sound dynamically over time. Hey, wait a minute. Did I just say element of sound? 3 elements of sound. 3 envelope generators. Volume, timbre, pitch. Hey! As you can see, these 3 envelope generators correspond exactly to the very 3 elements of sound we spoke about at the beginning of the tape. So is this starting to come together for you? The point is that for every aspect of sound that we can hear and describe and analyze, there is a corresponding component on your synthesizer. that will address that element of sound. Okay? All right, one more component, and then you and I both need to take a walk to the all-night deli for some frozen pizza. So, what's left? We've covered the amplifier, the oscillator, the filter, the 3 envelope generators, volume, filter, and pitch. And last but by no means least is the good old LFO, not to be confused with the PLO or the BYO or the Alamo. The LFO stands for low frequency oscillator. Interestingly enough, the LFO is exactly the same as the main oscillator, except for one important characteristic. It oscillates, that is, it vibrates at a low frequency. How low? Usually lower than 20 times a second. In other words, lower than our audible frequency range. That's why it's called the low frequency oscillator. So, why generate a frequency that only elephants and pigeons can hear? Well, the reason is because it's not actually routed to the audio path of the synthesizer. We don't hear it directly, but we do hear it indirectly. You see, the LFO is not used as a sound source. It's used as a modulator. We hear its effect on various other components. What kind of effects am I talking about? Well, if you route the LFO to the oscillator, you are modulating the pitch of a sound. Another word for pitch modulation is vibrato, to the frequency of the oscillators. If you route the LFO to the amplifier, you are modulating the amplitude or volume of the sound. And another word for amplitude modulation is tremolo. If you route the LFO to the filter, you're modulating the harmonic content of the sound. And, well, there is no other word for filter modulation. It's just called filter modulation. To the filter. In some sense, you can even route the LFO so that it controls the width of the pulse wave. This is called pulse width modulation, and it sounds like this. To the pulse width of A and B. In very simple terms, the LFO makes things wiggle. And variables such as how fast a sound wiggles or how much a sound wiggles are all controlled by settings within the LFO section of your synthesizer. Okay. So before we wrap this up, let's try making a sound from scratch and see if we can somehow tie together all these miscellaneous components. Let's start with a simple string sound. All right, campers, let's try and put all this stuff together. Let's try making a simple string sound by using the main components that we've already talked about. Let's start in the oscillator section and select the waveform. We can select any one of these three or all three, or any combination thereof. And we have a dual oscillator system, so we can combine in varying amounts to suit our needs. We can always go back later and adjust it, but for now, let's select a combination of waveforms that has a certain amount of brightness to it. Remember, you can always filter out too much brightness. Let's introduce the second oscillator. And now let's detune the two oscillators to get a little chorusing. See how easily simply adjusting the fine tuning or detuning these two oscillators can turn this flat sound into a lush sound. We could, at any point along the way, adjust the pulse width of this pulse wave. And adjust the relative balance of the two oscillators. design a string-like volume envelope. We're going to want a slow attack. And a slow release. All right, well, that's sending us in the right direction. That is a string-like volume envelope. And our textures are appropriate for our needs. Let's try designing a filter envelope that will address an important characteristic of a string sound. The attack of a string sound, which contains a rosin effect. We'll do that by adding a small amount of brightness in the very beginning of the filter envelope. First, let's lower the sustain level. In order to exaggerate the beginning. You can hear how simply by adding a little bit of attack, I've created a brightness shape in the very beginning of this string envelope. With some adjustment, this can successfully emulate the characteristics of a real string. Slight adjustments can be made by changing the cutoff point of the filter. And by adjusting the envelope amount. Let me just... Although it may seem subtle, here's an example where we have designed a filter envelope superimposed on top of the volume envelope to help give shape to the overall sound. Let's do one more thing, and that is add LFO into the string sound to emulate the kind of natural vibrato that a human string player would impart. I can choose to send the LFO modulation to any of three destinations: to the frequency of A and B, that is to control the pitch of the oscillator; to the pulse width of A and B, that is to control the width of the pulse wave of both oscillators; or to the filter. Let's see what happens if we modulate the pulse width, seeing as I am employing two pulse waves, one in each of the oscillators. I've routed the LFO to the pulse width, and now let me increase the amount of the LFO to hear what its effect will be. As you can hear, the pulse width modulation imparts a very subtle modulation into the sound that is similar to the vibrato we're looking for. This is not vibrato per se because we're not modulating pitch. We're modulating the width of the pulse wave. And there we have it, folks. A simple string sound. As you can begin to see, I was able to make this sound by applying the very principles we've discussed, the 5 most common waveforms and the 7 main components. Let's just review my steps. First, I selected waveforms in the oscillator section. I chose from among sawtooth waves, triangle waves, and pulse waves. Remember, the pulse wave, when its duty cycle is at 50%, is a square wave. Then, by controlling the pitch of one of the 2 oscillators, I was able to achieve a chorusing effect to fatten up the sound. Remember, the oscillator controls pitch. Next, I designed a volume envelope to create an overall shape for my sound. Remember, the envelope generator in tandem with the amplifier creates the volume envelope. Then, I designed a filter envelope to create a particular brightness shape for the rosiny bow-like effect. Next, I modified it slightly using the filter. Finally, I went to the LFO, the low-frequency oscillator, and using a triangle wave as a modulator, I modulated the pulse wave in the oscillator section. This is just one example of how to employ some of these waveforms and components to make sounds. The newer hybrid synths, like the Ensoniq SQ80, the Roland D50, the Korg M1, offer variations on these methods, but the basic principles are still the same. All synths have an oscillator section that lets you alter pitch. All synths have a volume envelope. All synths have some kind of a filter or method for altering harmonic content. And all synths have some kind of an LFO. They may call them by a different name. They may implement them slightly differently. But essentially, these 7 main components are the same regardless of make or model number. An oscillator is an oscillator, a volume envelope is a volume envelope, and an LFO is an LFO. And those 7 main components are what this series is all about. And that's it for part 1. Sure, we still have to examine those 7 main components in greater detail and talk about how they interact with each other. And yes, there are a number of other parameters and effects, such as noise, sync, chorusing, keyboard follow, which we haven't talked about. But those 7 components I've just described to you are the real meat of the matter. Once you have a thorough understanding of what they are and how to manipulate them, you'll be well on your way to becoming an accomplished synthesist in your own right. So, any questions, just drop a line to the New York School of Synthesis, Post Office Box 878, Ansonia Station, New York, New York, 10023. Please enclose a self-addressed stamped envelope for reply, only because we're cheap and we want to save on postage. Well, see you all next time. All right, where's the pizza?